What if the perfect Hollywood family you admired on red carpets, in magazine covers, and in tear-jerking interviews had been living with a secret so devastating it eventually killed them? Not metaphorically, not emotionally. Killed. As in brutally, violently, and in their own home. Rob Reiner, 78. Michelle Singer, 70. Found stabbed to death inside their multi-million-dollar Brentwood estate. A knife, a trail of blood, and their son, Nick Reiner, 32, taken into custody just hours later. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But this isn't a story about a single tragic night. This isn't just a murder investigation. This is about everything that happened before. It's about what Rob Reiner, the beloved director, activist, and pillar of American culture, finally confessed in his final days. Not on camera, not to a journalist, but in a private, encrypted audio file labeled only for Romy. It's about secrets, about silence, about what happens when a family is more afraid of shame than of truth. And it's about a decision made 15 years ago, a decision Rob called the biggest mistake I ever made as a father. You think you know this story, but I promise you, you don't. Because buried under all the headlines is a truth that's been kept out of sight for nearly 2 decades. So buckle up. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you see Rob Reiner, his son Nick, and the image of Hollywood royalty forever. Let's rewind. Not to the night of the murders, not to the arrest. Let's go further back. Picture it. Los Angeles, 2008. Nick Reiner is 17 years old. He's the youngest child of a beloved entertainment power couple. His father, Rob, is fresh off critical acclaim as a director. His mother, Michelle, is a respected photographer and advocate. Their Brentwood mansion is a sanctuary of wealth, art, and influence. But inside, things aren't picture perfect. Because one night, according to never-before-heard accounts from 2 former staffers, Nick erupted in a violent outburst that left a family dog injured and a household staff member hospitalized with a fractured wrist. There were no charges, no police reports, no TMZ coverage. Why? Because within 48 hours, Nick was gone. Quietly removed from the public eye and sent to a private psychiatric facility in Arizona under a different name. The official story? Nick's away at a therapeutic wilderness camp. The real story? He was institutionalized after what Rob would later describe as a terrifying descent into delusion and rage. Now here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Rob and Michelle didn't want this to leak. They were terrified of what the press might do to Nick, and what it might mean for Rob's public image as a progressive, emotionally intelligent father. So they did what many in Hollywood do when secrets get dangerous. They buried them. Literally, figuratively, legally. Records were sealed. A top crisis PR firm was hired to manage any possible leaks. A lawyer known for representing A-list celebrities in sensitive family matters was brought in. And Nick? He came home 8 months later, like nothing had ever happened. But someone never forgot. And that someone was Romy Reiner. Romy was just 10 years old when Nick disappeared. And even at that age, she knew something wasn't right. She remembered the screaming, the broken furniture, the way their mother cried in the hallway. She remembered the locks being changed on the bedroom doors. She remembered the fear. And most of all, she remembered what she was told. Your brother's just going somewhere to get better. He's going to learn how to manage his emotions. But when Nick came back, Romy told a close friend, in an email that would later surface in the investigation, he's not better. He's worse. And they're all pretending it's fine. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been told to ignore your instincts because it's more polite to stay quiet? That's what this family lived with. For years. And slowly, the weight of silence began to crush them. Fast forward to 2023. Nick is 31. He lives in the guest house behind the main estate. Romy has moved out, but visits often. Rob's health is declining. Michelle is reportedly increasingly anxious, according to a longtime family assistant who later spoke anonymously to police. Neighbors start noticing strange noises coming from the guest house. Screams. Loud crashes. Police are called once, but leave without filing a report. Another silence. Another cover-up. And then, something strange happens. Rob records an audio file. Not a video. Not a memoir. Not a journal entry. An encrypted voice note, saved on a secure drive, addressed specifically to Romy, entitled Only, If You're Hearing This. In it, he admits the truth, the institutionalization, the cover-up, the fear, and the biggest bombshell, that he and Michelle knew Nick had dangerous tendencies, that he had attacked another family member, but the incident had been cleaned up with legal help and a non-disclosure agreement. Rob says in the file, "I thought I was protecting him, but I see now. I was protecting myself, and it might cost us all." This file would not be found until days after Rob and Michelle were killed. But Romy? She already knew something was wrong, and she had already made a call. A week before the murders, Romy reportedly visited a local LAPD precinct, not to file a complaint, but to issue a warning. To this day, that file remains sealed. But according to two insiders close to the case, she used the word dangerous. She named a suspect, and she begged them to do something before it's too late. It was too late. On Sunday, December 14th, at approximately 8:32 p.m., Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer were found stabbed to death in their home. Multiple sharp force injuries, no signs of forced entry, and Nick, covered in scratches and blood, sitting on the floor of the guest house, rocking back and forth. Police detained him on the spot, but it was what Romy told police that night that would change everything. She looked the lead detective in the eye and said, "You need to look at the files in Dad's office. There's something you need to hear." So here's the question. Why would a father wait until the end of his life to confess the darkest truth about his son? Why did Romy feel it was inevitable? And what else has this family kept hidden from the world? Because what came next, what police discovered in that office, in that audio file, and in the vault underneath Rob's study, would unravel a 15-year cover-up, expose a network of high-level protectors, and reveal the darkest chapter in one of Hollywood's most respected legacies. And no one, not even those closest to the Reiners, saw it coming. What do you do when the call you've dreaded for years finally comes, and it's worse than you imagined? It was just after 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, December 14th. The Reiner estate, nestled in the quiet, manicured streets of Brentwood, should have been winding down for the night. The lights in the main house had dimmed. Outside, the soft hum of the fountain in the garden could be heard from the guest house. All signs pointed to a calm, uneventful evening. But inside, a horror was unfolding. It began with a single phone call. Romy Reiner, 27, hadn't planned to stop by that night. In fact, she almost didn't answer when her father called her earlier that afternoon. The voicemail he left, just 10 seconds long, now plays over and over in her mind. "Hey, honey. Just checking in. I love you." That was it. No jokes. No long-winded storytelling. No movie quotes. Just Rob Reiner, sounding distant, tired, as if he knew something was coming. And maybe he did, because hours later, Romy's phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't her father. It was the Brentwood police. They needed her to come to the estate immediately. Let's rewind those few crucial hours to 7:53 p.m. A neighbor walking their dog near the Reiner property noticed something strange. Flickering lights inside the main house, followed by the sudden sound of shattering glass. At first, it didn't seem serious. This was Brentwood, a safe, upscale neighborhood where strange noises were often just the result of private chefs or elaborate Christmas decorations gone wrong. But then came the scream. One long, blood-curdling scream, abruptly cut off. The neighbor paused. The dog barked. Another sound followed. A second crash. A frantic thud. Not like someone dropping something, but like someone falling. Then silence. The neighbor called it in. A wellness check. And when officers arrived at 8:19 p.m., nothing could have prepared them for what they would find. Front door? Locked. Back patio? Unsecured. Inside? Dim lighting. Classical music playing softly from a speaker in the study. A faint smell of incense. Or was it something burning? Officers began a sweep. First the kitchen, then the hallway, then the living room. And that's where they saw it. A dark smear across the tile floor. Blood. A lot of it. Trailing from the edge of the hall, around the corner, leading toward the den. What they found next would be etched into every report, every autopsy file, every sleepless night of the officers on duty. Rob Reiner was lying face down beside the fireplace, his shirt soaked in blood, one hand outstretched, as if he had been reaching for something. His phone, his wife. Just a few feet away, Michelle Singer lay motionless on the rug, her blouse torn, multiple wounds across her torso and neck. Her eyes, open. They were pronounced dead at the scene. Time of death, estimated between 7:45 and 8:05 p.m. Manner, homicide. Cause, multiple sharp force injuries, the clinical term for stabbing. But the scene didn't end there. Because once backup arrived and a full sweep of the property began, they turned their attention to the guest house. The small, luxurious two-bedroom unit tucked behind the estate, where Nick Reiner had been living for the past 18 months. The door was locked. Officers knocked. No response. They circled to the side window, and that's when they saw him. Sitting cross-legged in the middle of the room, eyes fixed on the floor, hands covered in what appeared to be blood. One officer shouted. Nick didn't move. A second shout. Still nothing. Finally, they forced entry, and that's when Nick looked up and asked one chilling question. Did they tell you what they did to me? No one responded. Nick was cuffed on the spot. No resistance. No protest. He just kept whispering something. A phrase caught on one officer's body cam. They shouldn't have made me remember. By the time Romy arrived on the scene, the street was blocked off. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the usually serene driveway. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the front hedges. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. News vans were already on the way. She stepped out of her car and approached the officers. They tried to stop her, but she insisted. And when she saw the body bags being wheeled out of the front entrance, something inside her cracked. Not just grief, not just shock, recognition. Because, according to a statement later leaked from the precinct, the very first thing Romy said wasn't, "What happened?" It was, "Check Dad's office. There's something in there. Something you need to hear." What exactly had she known? Let's take a step back. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Romy had been increasingly concerned about her brother. Close friends report she had confided in them more than once. In one chilling message sent to a longtime friend just 10 days before the killings, she wrote, "I'm scared of what's going to happen. Something's not right with Nick. And I don't think Mom and Dad are facing it anymore. They just want peace, but I think it's too late." She knew something was coming. She just didn't know when. And according to that same friend, Romy had even begun gathering documents. Old journals, therapy notes, family emails. But why? Because of a story her father had told her one night, after too many glasses of wine, when Michelle had gone to bed early and Nick was asleep in the guest house. It was the first time Rob ever admitted the truth. That when Nick was 17, he had been institutionalized after an episode so violent, so terrifying, that the Reiners had to call in favors from multiple friends in law enforcement and mental health to ensure the incident never made it into the press. That they sealed the records. That they paid hush money. That they told everyone it was a therapeutic retreat, not a psychiatric lockdown. Rob called it his shame file. Romy, stunned, asked him, "Why are you telling me this now?" And his answer? "Because I need someone to know the truth, in case something ever happens." So when Romy stood at the foot of her parents' driveway that night, blood on the ground, her brother in cuffs, her whole world up in smoke, she remembered those words. And she pointed police exactly where they needed to go. To the office, to the vault, to the confession that would turn a family tragedy into a national obsession. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. How could a man who made a career telling stories of justice, redemption, and love miss the one unfolding in his own home? He was known for films that made people cry, laugh, and believe in the human spirit. Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. Rob Reiner wasn't just a director. He was a storyteller, a cultural icon, the man who gave voice to underdogs, misfits, and truth-tellers. But for all his accolades, all the awards, all the standing ovations, he failed to see the darkness growing within his own family. Or maybe he saw it and turned away, because facing it would mean admitting he'd failed, not as a filmmaker, but as a father. Rob Reiner loved being a dad. Ask anyone who knew him. On set, he carried photos of his kids. In interviews, he gushed about fatherhood being the greatest role of my life. He advocated for children's rights, pushed for progressive education reform, donated millions to causes that uplifted young people. And yet, when it came to Nick, things were complicated. Friends say Rob and Michelle had always been protective of their youngest. Even when Nick was a child, there were whispers among friends of tantrums beyond normal, of mood swings that frightened teachers, of playdates that ended in tears. But Rob didn't want Nick labeled. That was his fear. He once told a close friend, "I grew up in a spotlight. I don't want him scrutinized. I want him free." So when early warning signs appeared, suspensions from school, aggressive behavior, arguments with teachers, the Reiners didn't pursue a diagnosis. They brought in tutors, changed schools, moved cities, anything but labels, anything but public shame. It wasn't denial. It was protection. At least, that's how Rob justified it. But was it actually enabling? Let's rewind again. This time, to 2005. Nick is 14, quiet, intense, artistically gifted, but increasingly isolated. At one point, he's enrolled in a private arts-focused academy in the San Fernando Valley. Less than 6 weeks later, he's withdrawn. One former classmate, who requested anonymity, recalls a disturbing incident. He snapped at a kid over a sketch they were working on, flipped the desk, threw a chair. The teacher locked the room and called the office. No charges were filed. No disciplinary record exists, because Rob Reiner was on the board of donors for the school. The problem was handled internally, a phrase we would hear again and again. In Hollywood, powerful families don't just have money. They have pull. A call from Rob Reiner wasn't just a call. It was a signal, protect us. And for years, the machine worked. Journalists were kept at bay. Rumors were quashed. Even when Nick was 16 and allegedly involved in a physical altercation with a cousin, an incident described in hushed tones by extended family, nothing ever reached the public. Why? Because Rob believed in second chances. Because he believed that telling the world his son had problems would only make those problems worse. And because, deep down, he carried guilt. You see, Rob hadn't always been around. In Nick's formative years, he was juggling a full slate of films, directing, producing, traveling, doing press tours in Europe, testifying before Congress on political causes. Michelle did most of the parenting. Romy, just a few years older than Nick, often acted as his buffer. And when signs of deeper issues emerged, insomnia, paranoia, verbal abuse, Rob wasn't home to witness most of it. By the time he fully understood the scope of Nick's behavior, it was already spiraling. Let's talk about the night Rob broke down. It's 2017. Nick is 26 and has been living at a sober living house in Venice after a brief stint in rehab. Rob visits him one evening, hoping for reconciliation. Instead, the meeting ends with Nick screaming, shoving a chair, and storming off. Witnesses say Rob sat in his car afterward for nearly an hour, staring, crying. Later, he told a friend, "I don't know who he is anymore. I feel like I missed the moment when I could have helped him. Now, I just feel like a bystander." It was one of the first cracks in the public image. Privately, Rob was unraveling. But publicly, the mask stayed on. Until that audio file. Let's go back to that now famous encrypted audio, the one labeled for Romy. Here's what it revealed. In his own words, Rob said, "There were moments where I looked at Nick and I didn't recognize my son. Not because he was angry, but because I realized I never really got to know the real him. I was too busy, too hopeful, too afraid to admit something might be deeply wrong." He continues, "Your mother and I made a decision when you were kids. When Nick had his first real episode. When he hurt the dog, when he pushed the housekeeper, we didn't go public. We went private. Private doctors, private rehab, private settlements. We buried it. Because we thought, he's just young. He'll grow out of it." But he didn't. And then, the confession that broke the internet when it was leaked. At 17, he was institutionalized. A full psychiatric lockdown. Not for therapy. Not for anger management. For violent, unpredictable behavior. And I used every contact I had to keep it off the books. And the most haunting line? It was the biggest mistake of my life. Now ask yourself, what would you do? If your child was spiraling? If their actions were dangerous? If their name, and yours, were tied to every headline? Would you protect them at all costs? Would you hide the truth to save their future? Or would you risk it all to get them real help? Even if it meant losing control of the narrative? That's the contradiction Rob lived with. He was the director of courtroom dramas where truth wins out. The man behind stories of justice, healing, redemption. But in his own home, when it mattered most, he chose secrecy. And it cost him everything. Some say Rob's biggest blind spot was hope. He wanted to believe Nick could be better. He wanted to believe that love and money and time could fix whatever had broken inside his son. But the more he protected him, the more Nick resented him. One former therapist, now deceased, but whose notes were found in the Reiner vault, wrote, "Client exhibits deep feelings of abandonment, resentment toward father figure. Believes he was hidden not because of illness, but because of shame. Alternates between intense affection and aggressive outbursts." Nick didn't just suffer from mental illness. He felt like a ghost in his own home, seen only when convenient, loved only when manageable, and that may have been what finally tipped him over the edge. There's one more scene you need to hear about. 2 weeks before the murders, Rob and Michelle hosted a small family dinner. Just them, Romy, and Nick. No staff, no friends. It was supposed to be a quiet holiday catch-up. Sources say the evening started fine. Laughs, wine, old stories. But by dessert, things turned. Nick allegedly lashed out, accusing them of planning to cut him off, claiming they were rewriting the will, saying he knew what they were hiding. Romy tried to calm him. Michelle stood up to leave. Nick stormed out. Rob didn't follow. He just sighed, looked at Romy, and said, "We waited too long." And then, 14 days later, they were gone. Stabbed in the very house they tried to keep safe. In the shadow of the guest house they gave him as a sign of trust. And Rob, the man who told millions of Americans stories about truth, he died holding on to a truth he finally spoke, but far too late. But while Rob's silence protected Nick for years, it also enabled something else. Because what investigators found after opening that vault and reading Michelle's private journals revealed her side of the story. And what Michelle knew changes everything we thought we understood about this family. What if the most dangerous moment in this story didn't happen on the night of the murders, but 15 years earlier, behind locked doors no one was allowed to see? You already know the outline. The whispers, the gaps, the months that never quite added up. But now we go inside the place the family never wanted anyone to find. The place Rob would later call the beginning of the end. It starts with a van. No sirens. No uniforms. No paperwork anyone could trace. Just a black transport vehicle pulling up to a gated driveway before sunrise, its engine idling softly so the neighbors wouldn't notice. Nick was 17. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't say goodbye. According to a former household staffer, he was told he was going on a retreat, a reset, a chance to breathe. But the moment the doors closed, the truth became clear. Because this wasn't a retreat. This was a private psychiatric facility designed for families with money, influence, and something to hide. The facility sat outside Scottsdale, Arizona. No sign on the road. No website that the public could access. Patients were admitted under aliases. Records were kept off standard databases. If you didn't already know it existed, you would never find it. And that was the point. The intake report, later discovered in a sealed envelope in Rob's vault, described Nick as agitated, paranoid, prone to sudden violent ideation. Not stressed, not rebellious, not troubled, violent. That word appears 6 times in the first 3 pages. And here's the contradiction that haunts this story. At the same time Rob was publicly advocating for youth compassion and mental health awareness, he was privately signing documents that allowed his son to be confined without external oversight. Why? Because he was terrified. Terrified of what Nick might do. And terrified of what the world would say if it ever found out. Inside the facility, Nick was stripped of his phone, his clothes, his name. He was given a number. Therapy sessions began immediately. Twice a day. Sometimes more if he refused medication. One clinician's notes, heavily redacted, but still chilling, describe an incident in the first week. Patient experienced dissociative episode. Became physically aggressive when confronted with parental boundaries. Required restraint. Let that sink in. Restraint. This wasn't a gentle healing environment. This was containment. And Rob knew it. In the audio file later found in his office, he admits, "I told myself it was temporary, that it was for his own good. But the truth is, I needed him somewhere I couldn't see him. Somewhere his pain wouldn't look back at me." That's not the voice of a villain. That's the voice of a man who ran out of answers. Nick stayed there for 9 weeks. 9 weeks that were erased from his official life. School transcripts show a medical leave. Friends were told he was traveling. Family members were instructed not to ask questions. Even Romy wasn't told the truth. She was 10 years old and kept in the dark. Why? Because Michelle insisted. According to her journal, she believed telling Romy would poison her relationship with her brother forever. So instead, they told Romy that Nick was learning how to calm his emotions. But when Nick came back, nothing was calm. He returned thinner, quieter, watchful. Family photos from that year show him standing slightly apart, eyes down, jaw clenched. One former friend recalls trying to joke with him. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. Then he smiled. But it wasn't normal. It was like he was testing what a smile was supposed to look like. Inside, something had hardened. And according to a therapist who later treated him privately, Nick felt betrayed. Not just by the facility, by his parents. Because in his mind, they didn't send him away to get help. They sent him away to disappear. Here's the part that changes how you see everything that followed. Nick didn't just remember the stay. He obsessed over it. He brought it up during arguments, during holidays, during moments that had nothing to do with the past. You locked me up, he would say. You chose them over me. You hid me. And Rob would respond the same way every time. We were trying to protect you. But Nick heard something else. We were trying to protect ourselves. Over the years, Rob tried to rationalize the decision. He told himself the facility saved Nick from doing something irreversible. He told himself the silence spared his son from public judgment. He told himself time would heal the wound. But time doesn't heal secrets. It feeds them. And Nick carried that secret like a weapon. Fast forward again. Nick is in his late 20s. The guest house arrangement begins. From the outside, it looks generous, compassionate. From the inside, it's strategic. Close enough to monitor, far enough to contain. Michelle writes in her journal, I sleep better knowing there's a door between us. That line is underlined twice. Read that again. A mother sleeping better because her son is separated by a locked door. Does that sound like healing? Or fear? Now here's where the story tightens. During a renovation of the main house, Rob installed a hidden safe in his study. Not for money, for documents. Inside, therapy notes, legal correspondence, medical evaluations, and one intake form from Arizona. Nick's alias was still visible, but the diagnosis had been circled in red. And next to it, in Rob's handwriting, just 3 words. Never again. Too dangerous. Those words were never meant to be read by anyone else. Until they were. Investigators would later say this chapter of Nick's life reframed the entire case. Because suddenly, the narrative wasn't about a sudden break. It was about a long one. A fracture that began the moment a family chose silence over truth. Containment over confrontation. Image over intervention. And once you see it that way, the final act doesn't feel sudden at all. It feels inevitable. But the facility wasn't the only thing Nick never forgot. Because while Rob was burying records, Michelle was writing. And what she wrote, in journals no one was supposed to read, reveals a woman who knew the truth long before anyone else was willing to say it out loud. And when you hear her words, everything you thought you knew about her silence will shatter. Because Michelle wasn't blind. She was afraid. And what she feared most was her own son. What happens when a mother stops believing in the goodness of her own child, but says nothing? For decades, Michelle Singer Reiner stood quietly beside one of Hollywood's loudest men. While Rob spoke out at rallies, on red carpets, in interviews, and in courtrooms, Michelle was the calm in the storm. The one behind the camera. The one holding the house together while her husband held the mic. To the world, she was serene, strong, unshakable. But behind that calm exterior was a woman breaking under the weight of a secret she never wanted to carry. She didn't just know something was wrong with Nick. She lived with it. She saw it first. She felt it first. And, tragically, she stayed silent, long enough for it to consume everything. Let's go back to 2003. Nick was 12. Michelle wrote her first journal entry mentioning the shift. The entry is short, just a few lines. But it's the first breadcrumb. He stared at me tonight. Not like a kid, like a stranger. It chilled me. I didn't say anything to Rob. He'd just say Nick's tired. But I'm not so sure. That's the first moment Michelle allowed herself to say it, even if only privately. She sensed it, that something dark was forming. Not just typical teenage angst. Not hormones. Not rebellion. A disconnection. A darkness she couldn't name. And from that moment on, she began keeping 2 lives. The one she presented to the world, the smiling mother, the supportive wife, the quiet philanthropist. And the one she lived inside her journals. where she recorded things no mother wants to admit. Over the next few years, her entries paint a chilling portrait of a boy spiraling and a mother unraveling beside him. At 13, he screamed at the gardener today, over the sprinklers. I asked him to apologize. He slammed the door so hard it cracked. I told Rob. He said to give him space. I'm starting to feel afraid in my own home. At 15, found a dead bird in the pool. At first I thought it drowned. Then I saw the rock. And the blood. I asked Nick if he knew anything. He smiled, then walked away. At 17, right before the institutionalization, Rob thinks we still have time. I know we don't. He's changing faster than we can understand. He talks to himself. I hear him in his room, arguing with no one. I'm scared of what happens if we don't do something now. Or worse, if we do. And then, nothing for months. No entries. Just blank pages. Until one day in 2009, she wrote, "He's back. But I don't think the facility helped. He's colder now. Smarter. He pretends better. But I feel it. The rage is still there. Just under the surface. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she speak out? Why didn't she warn someone?" The answer isn't simple. Because Michelle didn't feel powerful. Even in her own home. Not because Rob dominated her. But because the machine they'd built, the image, the legacy, the Reiner name, was too heavy to dismantle. She couldn't tell the world that her son terrified her. She couldn't tell Romy. Couldn't tell her friends. Couldn't tell the therapist who still looked to Rob for cues in every family session. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She wrote it down and prayed no one would ever have to read it. Here's the part that stings the most. One entry, dated just a year before the murders, reveals Michelle came this close to telling the truth. She had spoken to a former therapist. Not Nick's, her own. She told the therapist she was afraid. That Nick had begun standing over her while she slept. That she had woken up once to find him sitting in the hallway, just watching her. No words. No smile. Just watching. She asked the therapist if she should go to the police. You know what the therapist told her? You have no proof. If you report this and he hasn't done anything, they'll think you're the one with the issue. So Michelle went home, locked her bedroom door for the first time in her life, and wrote in her journal, "I can't protect us from what's already inside the house." But even in her fear, she still loved him. That's the contradiction that broke her. Because Michelle never stopped seeing Nick as her son, even when he raged, even when he threatened, even when he vanished for days and came back with glassy eyes and trembling hands. She loved him, and she kept hoping the boy she once held in her arms, the boy who used to draw monsters and tuck the pictures under her pillow, was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the pain, the illness, the anger. But hope can be a prison, too. And Michelle lived in it for years. So what finally changed? Why did she start documenting everything again in her final year? According to law enforcement sources familiar with the investigation, it was Romy. Because Romy had begun asking questions. Hard ones. She wanted to know what happened in Arizona. Why no one ever talked about it. Why her brother's name never appeared in school yearbooks for 2 years. And most importantly, why their mother always flinched when Nick entered a room. Michelle never answered directly. But she started writing again. Every day. And some of those final pages? They read like warnings. Romy is smarter than we were. She sees what we were too afraid to name. I fear for her. Not because she's blind. But because she isn't. If something happens to me, please, someone, read these. We've run out of second chances. The next time will be the last. And finally, in what would become her last entry. If we don't survive this, I hope the truth does. Think about that. Think about a mother who knew her child might one day kill her, and chose to stay, not because she was weak, but because she couldn't bring herself to stop believing in him. That's the kind of silence that breaks people, and it's the kind of silence that destroys families. So when the investigators opened that vault, when they saw the journals, page after page of heartbreak, dread, and quiet terror, they didn't just see a mother's writings. They saw a timeline, a record, a warning no one had listened to in time. But that wasn't the only thing Michelle left behind, because hidden between the pages of one of the final journals was a sealed envelope, unmarked. Inside, a copy of the intake report from Arizona, the one with Nick's alias, and a single sticky note attached. 3 words, in Michelle's delicate handwriting. He's still in there. That envelope would become central to the prosecution's case. But it wasn't the only document in that vault. Because in the bottom drawer, behind a false panel, was something no one expected. A letter, and signed, undated, but unmistakably written by Nick. And what he wrote next would leave investigators speechless. Because it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a confession. It was a plan. What if the person you feared most lived just steps away, and the only thing separating you from them was a single locked door? From the outside, the Reiners' guest house was a picture of quiet luxury. Modern stone and glass design. Private entrance. Full kitchen. Skylights. Security system. It was a detached oasis, perfect for artists, guests, or adult children needing privacy. But for Rob and Michelle, that guest house wasn't a luxury. It was a compromise. A ticking bomb placed in the backyard, disguised as compassion. And inside that sleek little structure lived a man carrying secrets, paranoia, and, as we now know, a plan that would bring everything crashing down. Let's back up. Nick moved into the guest house in 2021. Officially, it was framed as a temporary transition space, while he looked for a home of his own. Privately, Rob and Michelle were terrified to let him live any further away. According to Romy, they wanted him close enough to monitor, but not close enough to touch. So they gave him the guest house. They remodeled it, gave it smart locks, soundproofed walls, and most tellingly, they installed cameras. Not inside the guest house. That would have been too obvious, too invasive. But around it, 3 separate security cameras, one facing the guest house door, one aimed at the side yard, and one hidden inside a decorative birdhouse across from the patio entrance. Why? Because Michelle had begun to suspect Nick was sneaking into the main house at night. One entry in her journal reads, "Twice now, I've found things moved in the kitchen in the morning. A teacup left out. A knife in the sink. Rob says I'm imagining things, but I know where I left them." At first, they brushed it off as paranoia, until Romy caught Nick on the back patio at 3 a.m. He claimed he couldn't sleep, but when they reviewed the camera footage, he wasn't just pacing. He was watching the main house for over 40 minutes, just standing, staring, motionless. That was the first real warning. The second came 2 weeks later. A housekeeper, who had worked with the family for over a decade, submitted her resignation without notice. No explanation, just a short letter and a final paycheck left untouched. Later, in a confidential interview with LAPD, she said, "I couldn't be around him anymore. I told Michelle something was wrong. I told her he scared me." She said she knew, but they didn't know what else to do. So again, the Reiners chose silence, chose hope, chose proximity. But something was building, and Romy saw it more clearly than anyone. Over the next 6 months, Nick's behavior grew more erratic. Neighbors reported loud arguments echoing from the guest house late at night, though no one ever seemed to be on the receiving end. He was talking to himself, shouting at walls. In one instance, a delivery driver claims Nick chased him down the driveway, demanding to know who sent you. But there were no formal complaints, no wellness checks, because every time it started to reach the surface, it got buried again. Rob would call the neighbors, apologize. Michelle would bring cookies the next day, and the silence would return. Behind that silence, though, was growing dread. According to an internal memo from the private security firm that briefly worked the estate, Michelle requested a panic button be installed in the main bedroom. Not a dramatic, wall-mounted alarm. Something discreet, hidden, so they placed it under the nightstand. She asked if it could send a silent alert to the Brentwood police. She never activated it, but she pressed it every night before bed, just to feel the click, just to feel some sense of control. Let's talk about the letter now. The one found behind the false panel in the vault. It wasn't long, just half a page, handwritten. No salutation, no closing, but investigators quickly concluded it was written by Nick. The handwriting matched prior notes and journal entries recovered from his room. What did it say? "Brace yourself. I watch them pretend, like they've always pretended, like I'm the one who's broken. But they're the ones who locked me up, who lied, who covered everything. They owe me. They owe me years. They owe me silence. I won't ask again. I'll just take. Read that again. I'll just take." The implication couldn't be clearer. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a manifesto. And suddenly, all the oddities, the pacing, the stares, the late-night wanderings, weren't just eccentricities. They were rehearsals. And then there's the burner phone, found taped behind a vent in the guest house closet. Wiped clean. No contacts. No texts. But one recorded voice memo. Timestamp just 10 days before the murders. In a low, almost robotic voice, Nick says, "They think I've changed, but I just got better at hiding. I've had enough. I'm done watching them act like they did nothing. They'll know soon. They'll understand." He pauses, breathes, then ends the recording with, "And Romy? She should stop asking questions." Now imagine being Romy. You've suspected something for years. You felt it in your gut. You've warned your parents. And you've been dismissed every time. Then you find that voice memo. Then your brother turns his gaze on you. That's when Romy made her move. According to a sealed interview obtained by reporters, Romy went to the LAPD precinct just 5 days before the murders. She didn't file a formal report. She didn't name Nick directly. But she said, "There's someone in my family I believe is a danger to others, and possibly to themselves. I don't have proof yet, but I think something is about to happen." She asked the officer to look into an incident from years ago involving a psychiatric facility and sealed records. She left a copy of a journal entry, one of Michelle's, "We now know." She asked them to please act quickly. The file was marked as a civil concern. No action was taken. 2 days later, Romy told a friend, "I tried. I did everything I could, but I think I'm too late." She wasn't wrong. And on the night of December 14th, everything she feared, everything Michelle feared, became reality. Nick didn't just break. He followed a script he had been writing in silence, line by line, stare by stare, and it all started in that guest house. But here's the twist. Because while Nick was planning, watching, and waiting, someone else had already taken precautions of their own. Someone who knew the guest house wasn't the only place hiding secrets. Someone who had access to a second vault. And inside that vault, they didn't just find evidence. They found a recording of a therapy session from the Arizona facility. And what Nick confessed to during that session, at just 17 years old, may be the most disturbing revelation in this case yet. What if the only person willing to tell the truth was the one who wasn't supposed to know any of it? From the moment she was born, Romy Reiner was surrounded by stories. Her father told them to the world. Her mother captured them through a lens. And her family was wrapped in the kind of legacy most kids only see on movie screens. But somewhere between red carpets and quiet kitchen breakfasts, Romy began to notice something no one else wanted to see. That her family's story was rotting at the core. She wasn't supposed to ask questions. She wasn't supposed to open the locked drawers, read the old notebooks, or press the panic button in her mother's room. But she did. And because she did, we now know the truth. The question is, why didn't anyone listen? Romy was always described as the bright one. Sharp, creative, insightful. A blend of her mother's intuition and her father's gift for language. But unlike her brother, she was quiet, observant. She watched more than she spoke. And in a house full of distractions, cameras, assistants, appointments, screenings, that made her almost invisible. But she saw everything. She was only 10 when Nick was institutionalized. Too young, they thought, to understand. Too innocent, they hoped, to ask. So they lied. Told her he was away at a boarding camp, a therapeutic retreat for young men. But Romy wasn't just watching. She was remembering. The way her mom looked when she thought no one was watching. The way her dad avoided eye contact every time Nick's name came up. The way the hallway outside Nick's room stayed locked for weeks. She wasn't a child with a wild imagination. She was a daughter slowly realizing something was terribly wrong. Years later, when she was 16, she found the first piece of truth. It was in an old file drawer in her father's office. Mislabeled. Almost forgotten. A faded intake summary from the Arizona facility, marked confidential, with her brother's pseudonym scribbled on the cover. She didn't understand everything, but she saw the words, violent outburst, hallucinations, restrained. She read them again, and then she closed the file, walked out of the room, and never said a word. Why? Because by that point, she already knew the rules. In the Reiner household, silence wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was survival. Romy began writing, too. Like her mother, she kept journals. Dozens of them. In them, she tracked her brother's behavior. Documented things she saw. Things she heard. Things that frightened her. One entry, written just a week before her high school graduation, reads, "He walked past my room and whispered something. I don't even think he knew I was awake. He said, "Soon they'll see. They'll all see." I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just months later, he told me Dad was lying to me, that they locked him up and erased him. He says he sees things, that he's being followed. I tried to tell Mom. She told me to be patient, that he's not well. But what if it's more than that? These weren't dramatic diary entries. They were field notes. And she wasn't imagining it, because it kept getting worse. By her early 20s, Romy had moved out, got her own place in Los Feliz, started making short films, went to therapy, created distance. But she couldn't stay away. She visited her parents often, checked in, brought groceries, played mediator when Nick's moods grew unpredictable. But she always knew, always, that one day, things would come to a breaking point. The only question was when. So she started preparing. She began collecting copies of old documents, making digital backups of Michelle's journals, photographing letters she wasn't supposed to see, saving voicemails, screenshots, emails, not because she wanted to expose anyone, but because she felt, in her bones, that someone would need them one day. In one voice memo she saved to her personal drive, she says, "If something ever happens to them, to Mom or Dad, I need the truth to be known. I won't let this die in silence." She sent that memo to herself on October 19th, 2024. Exactly 2 months before the murders. Let's talk about what happened at the precinct. The visit Romy made to LAPD on December 9th, 5 days before the crime. She didn't go in screaming. She didn't accuse her brother directly. She came in calm, controlled, prepared. She had a binder, documents, a handwritten letter from Michelle, a time-stamped audio clip from Nick's burner phone. She told the officer on duty that she wasn't filing a formal complaint yet. She was there to warn, to document, to leave a trail. But she made one thing crystal clear. There is a person in my family who is capable of hurting others. He has a history. He has threatened us. My father has evidence in his office. Please take this seriously. The officer reportedly told her they would elevate it to a supervisor. But nothing happened. No wellness check. No investigation. No warning. Romy walked out of the station knowing she had done everything she could, and still fearing it wasn't enough. She was right. Here's where the story darkens even further. After the murders, investigators found a second journal of Romy's, one she kept hidden from her parents. Inside was a note, undated, written directly to her brother. "Nick, I loved you once. I still do, in some broken way. But I can't trust you. I don't know what you're planning. I see how you look at them, and I think you hate them more than you love anyone. How far would you go to bury the truth? If the truth could destroy everything you've built." In Hollywood, image is everything. Careers rise and fall on perception. Reputations are curated like museum exhibits, carefully lit, delicately worded, and always missing just enough to keep you guessing. For decades, Rob Reiner had been one of the untouchables, a cultural icon, a progressive voice, the guy who could walk into a room and disarm everyone with warmth, humor, and principle. But behind the curtain was a machine, a network of publicists, attorneys, agents, executives, and crisis managers, all working overtime to make sure one thing never reached the surface. Nick, not the real Nick, not the broken, paranoid, angry young man they were raising, not the incident, not the diagnosis, and definitely not the file. Let's talk about that file. It belonged to Dr. Ellis Crane, a veteran family therapist who had worked quietly with some of the biggest names in Los Angeles. Discreet, expensive, totally off the record. Crane had seen Nick in a private capacity shortly after he returned from the Arizona facility. The sessions were billed under an alias. No insurance, no paper trail, but Crane kept his own notes. Typed, password protected, hidden in a locked USB drive tucked inside a hollowed-out book in his home office. And when Crane passed away in 2023, those notes were passed, according to his will, to a trusted colleague, who, after hearing about the Reiner murders, contacted LAPD. What the file contained made even seasoned detectives stop and reevaluate the case from the beginning, because it confirmed something dark and suggested something even darker. The sessions began in early 2009. Crane's notes described Nick as polite but guarded, hyper-aware of being evaluated, displays deflection techniques learned in institutional setting. In the third session, Crane wrote, Subject speaks of prior treatment as punishment. Believes parents were more concerned with reputation than with healing. Demonstrates capacity for manipulation. Performs empathy, but disengages when challenged. Later notes reveal a conversation that would become pivotal in understanding Nick's psychology. Crane asked him directly, "Do you ever imagine hurting your parents?" Nick replied, "No, that would be stupid. I'd get caught." Crane asked, "But do you think about it?" Nick paused, then said, "I think about what it would be like if they were gone. If I didn't have to pretend anymore." Crane followed up, "Pretend what?" Nick smiled, "That I'm okay." The most disturbing entry? Session number 9. Nick described a recurring dream. "I'm walking through the house. It's quiet, dark. I go into their room. I stand over them. I don't do anything. I just watch. But they can't wake up. They just lie there. And I finally feel still." Crane underlined that sentence. "I finally feel still." What does that tell you? This wasn't just unresolved trauma. This was a blueprint of emotional detachment, paired with lingering resentment, reinforced by years of enabling silence. And still, nothing was done. Because Crane, like so many others, knew one thing. You don't bring down a Reiner. Not unless you're ready for the backlash. That's the part nobody talks about. What it actually means to be protected in Hollywood. It's not just about lawyers or PR spin. It's about access. It's about favors. About whispered warnings to media outlets. Kill that story or lose our client list. About quiet phone calls to a judge who wants vacation with a producer. About invisible red tape wrapped so tightly around the truth that most people stop pulling. Rob didn't create that machine, but he used it. And nowhere was that clearer than in 2008, the year Nick was institutionalized. Because during those 9 weeks in Arizona, multiple records disappeared. No school transcripts for that semester. No insurance claims. No court filings. The police report tied to the triggering incident vanished. How? Because Rob's attorney, the same man who had represented A-listers in high-profile scandals, made sure of it. According to a leaked deposition from a former legal assistant, the firm initiated a scrub protocol on Nick's records. "We were instructed to remove all identifying references to the incident. Seal what we could. Replace names." The goal was to leave no trail. And it worked. Until now. Then there's the press. 3 separate journalists reportedly received anonymous tips about Nick's behavior between 2009 and 2014. None of the stories were ever published. One reporter, now retired, admitted, "We got the call. We started digging. But within 24 hours, my editor shut it down. Said the studio wouldn't be happy, and that if we wanted access to future projects, we'd better walk away." So they did. And the silence held. Because that's how this town works. Not with threats. With access. With premiere invites. Interview slots. Red carpet passes. Profile exclusives. You don't attack a king without burning your own castle. And then there was the PR firm. Not just any firm. One of the top crisis management teams in the country. They were hired in 2007. Paid a hefty retainer. And given one directive. Keep Nick out of the news. They reviewed social media. They monitored Google alerts. They ran background checks on anyone who came into contact with the family, staff, teachers, friends. And when necessary, they paid. In one email recovered by investigators, a representative from the firm writes, "The assistant has agreed to sign the NDA. Her silence is contingent on continued monthly compensation and job placement outside LA. Advise." Let that sink in. Someone inside the household saw something, tried to speak, and was bought out. All to protect the illusion of the perfect Hollywood family. But every cover-up has a shelf life. And Rob knew it. That's why he recorded the confession. Not for the world. For Romy. Because somewhere deep down, he realized the silence had metastasized. And that the machine he once used to protect his son had become the very thing trapping them all. In his final recording, he says, "I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was shielding him from the worst of the world. But I see now. I was shielding the world from him." That sentence will haunt the Reiner legacy forever. But it also explains everything. Why Rob never pushed harder for answers. Why Michelle locked her bedroom door. Why Romy started keeping backups. Because they all knew. And the machine that once protected their image became the cage they all died in. But here's the twist no one expected. The machine almost stopped Nick from being arrested, too. Because when police brought him in on the night of December 14th, they were met at the precinct by, you guessed it, an attorney. Not hired by Nick, but sent on behalf of the Reiner family. Rob and Michelle were already dead. So who made the call? Who activated the legal protocol before the bodies were even identified? That question is still unanswered. But one theory is gaining traction, that Nick himself made the call, from a burner, before the police even arrived. If that's true, then this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was something else, something planned, something protected. And the machine? It may have done exactly what it was designed to do, one final time. But it wasn't enough, because someone had already broken the silence. And the woman who did that wasn't part of the machine. She was the one it forgot to silence, the one it underestimated, the one who had been documenting everything since the beginning, Romy. And now that she'd seen the full extent of the cover-up, she was about to expose it all, starting with the therapist who was paid to disappear, but kept one last file, one last session, one last tape. And when investigators pressed play on that recording, everything changed. What happens when the voice you thought was gone forever starts talking again? The recording begins with the soft click of a cassette being loaded. Not digital, not cleaned up, not polished. Just static, breathing. The slow creak of a chair, the gentle rustle of paper, and then her voice. Dr. Evelyn Hart, the therapist no one expected to return to the story. The therapist whose notes had been scrubbed from every file, whose sessions were thought destroyed, whose silence had been bought, or so they thought. But Dr. Hart didn't delete everything. She made copies. One of them, she mailed to herself, postmarked, sealed, and marked hold for release in event of my death. The other? She left in a safe deposit box, with a letter addressed to Romy. Let's back up. Dr. Hart had been assigned to Nick during a brief window in 2011. This was after Arizona, after the Reiners pulled him from traditional therapy, but before Nick moved into the guest house. She worked under the radar. No press, no public association with the family. But privately, she was concerned. Her notes described compartmentalization, violent fantasies, and, most damningly, delusional self-justification. She believed Nick had developed a narrative in which he was not simply wronged, but Nick didn't just suffer from mental illness. He felt like a ghost in his own home, seen only when convenient, loved only when manageable, and that may have been what finally tipped him over the edge. There's one more scene you need to hear about. 2 weeks before the murders, Rob and Michelle hosted a small family dinner. Just them, Romy, and Nick. No staff, no friends. It was supposed to be a quiet holiday catch-up. Sources say the evening started fine. Laughs, wine, old stories. But by dessert, things turned. Nick allegedly lashed out, accusing them of planning to cut him off, claiming they were rewriting the will, saying he knew what they were hiding. Romy tried to calm him. Michelle stood up to leave. Nick stormed out. Rob didn't follow. He just sighed, looked at Romy, and said, "We waited too long." And then, 14 days later, they were gone. Stabbed in the very house they tried to keep safe. In the shadow of the guest house they gave him as a sign of trust. And Rob, the man who told millions of Americans stories about truth, he died holding on to a truth he finally spoke, but far too late. But while Rob's silence protected Nick for years, it also enabled something else. Because what investigators found after opening that vault and reading Michelle's private journals revealed her side of the story. And what Michelle knew changes everything we thought we understood about this family. What if the most dangerous moment in this story didn't happen on the night of the murders, but 15 years earlier, behind locked doors no one was allowed to see? You already know the outline. The whispers, the gaps, the months that never quite added up. But now we go inside the place the family never wanted anyone to find. The place Rob would later call the beginning of the end. It starts with a van. No sirens. No uniforms. No paperwork anyone could trace. Just a black transport vehicle pulling up to a gated driveway before sunrise, its engine idling softly so the neighbors wouldn't notice. Nick was 17. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't say goodbye. According to a former household staffer, he was told he was going on a retreat, a reset, a chance to breathe. But the moment the doors closed, the truth became clear. Because this wasn't a retreat. This was a private psychiatric facility designed for families with money, influence, and something to hide. The facility sat outside Scottsdale, Arizona. No sign on the road. No website that the public could access. Patients were admitted under aliases. Records were kept off standard databases. If you didn't already know it existed, you would never find it. And that was the point. The intake report, later discovered in a sealed envelope in Rob's vault, described Nick as agitated, paranoid, prone to sudden violent ideation. Not stressed, not rebellious, not troubled, violent. That word appears 6 times in the first 3 pages. And here's the contradiction that haunts this story. At the same time Rob was publicly advocating for youth compassion and mental health awareness, he was privately signing documents that allowed his son to be confined without external oversight. Why? Because he was terrified. Terrified of what Nick might do. And terrified of what the world would say if it ever found out. Inside the facility, Nick was stripped of his phone, his clothes, his name. He was given a number. Therapy sessions began immediately. Twice a day, sometimes more if he refused medication. One clinician's notes, heavily redacted, but still chilling, describe an incident in the first week. Patient experienced dissociative episode. Became physically aggressive when confronted with parental boundaries. Required restraint. Let that sink in. Restraint. This wasn't a gentle healing environment. This was containment. And Rob knew it. In the audio file later found in his office, he admits, "I told myself it was temporary, that it was for his own good. But the truth is, I needed him somewhere I couldn't see him. Somewhere his pain wouldn't look back at me." That's not the voice of a villain. That's the voice of a man who ran out of answers. Nick stayed there for 9 weeks. 9 weeks that were erased from his official life. School transcripts show a medical leave.